Hi guys, I've got a really cool wine to share with you today. This is actually a Prosecco from Dal Zotto. So here in Australia, and it's the 2022, but you'll see that it says Col Fondo, and I'm really keen to explain what that is and what it means. And before we touch on that, I wanted to quickly share a little bit more about this producer and Prosecco more generally. So this producer, Dal Zotto, actually pioneered Prosecco here in Australia, and one of their other Proseccos actually won Prosecco of the Year. I'm pretty sure it was this year, 2025. And if you don't know too much about Prosecco, it actually originated over in Italy. There's two key regions, one of which I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce. If you've been watching my videos, you'll know that pronunciation is not my strong suit. So we'll bring it up on the screen. But the other one is Prosecco, which is pretty self-explanatory. Quickly touching on in Italian wine law and the hierarchy of wines. So you'll probably have seen on a lot of Italian wines either DOC or DOCG. These are essentially, so DOC is the second from the top in the hierarchy of Italian wine, and DOCG is the top. So these are wines that have to meet really strict requirements and also reflect the style of that wine and that area. And the requirements are so strict that actually in Italy, the government has a wine tasting panel that actually tastes these wines to make sure that they are the best expression of these regions and of course of Italy. So Prosecco is typically made from a grape called Glera, and this one is also made from that grape variety. And this one, the reason why I'm super excited to talk to you about it is Col Fondo actually means, so Col Fondo actually means that it's made in the traditional method. And it says on the label that it's made in the traditional way that Italian farmers made this wine back in the day, before it actually changed to a cheaper method of production, which is the tank method. So I want to talk you through both of those. So starting off, when we think about winemaking more broadly, you may have heard of oxidative or reductive styles. Oxidative are essentially a style of winemaking that that exposes the wine to oxygen. So you get that interaction with oxygen, which changes the flavor profile. Essentially what happens when your bottle is aging in the cellar. And a reductive style is where we limit or reduce or stop entirely the interaction with oxygen. And what that does is it preserves the key varietal characteristics. So really common with wines like Riesling, for example. We don't age them in oak. We don't have that oxygen contact, but we do ferment them and age them in a tank so that we're preserving those key varietal characteristics and not changing or adding complexity through oxygen. So when we think about sparkling wine, there's a few different ways to make sparkling wine. I'm hoping that I remember every single one of them, but there's the traditional method, the transfer method, the tank method, carbonization, the Asti method, and the ancestral method. So that's all 6 of them. And originally, like this wine, Prosecco was made using the traditional method, which I'll talk you through. And then they later changed it to be made in the tank method, which most people, myself included, are really familiar with Prosecco that's been made in that way. So there's no interaction with oxygen. It preserves the fruit characteristics. You still get a beautiful sparkling wine, but it's very fruit forward and it doesn't have that additional complexity. So that is the Prosecco that we all sort of know and love. This one I think is fantastic because it's so unique to be able to actually try a Prosecco that actually is made in the traditional method. So if you've had a high quality sparkling or a champagne, you've probably had a sparkling or a champagne that's made in the traditional method. The traditional method is the most expensive production method for making champagne or sparkling. And that's because the secondary fermentation actually happens in the bottle. So I want to just explain both of them. So the traditional method is we make a still wine, we add it to the bottle, we top it up with a mixture of sugar and yeast, we put a lid on it, and that then kick starts the second fermentation. During that fermentation process, CO2, so carbon dioxide, is released, but because there's a lid on it, it's got nowhere to go. So it actually integrates into the wine, and that's what gives it the bubbles. But also through that process, the yeast dies and it integrates some of its flavors into the wine. It's a process called yeast autolysis. So you get that beautiful, nice, biscuity, toasty flavor. Generally, then what happens is very slowly over time, we need to turn the bottle upside down. It's a process called riddling. And essentially what that means is the sediment starts to move to the neck of the bottle. And then what we do is we dip it in a solution that freezes that sediment. And if you've ever popped a cork on a champagne or a sparkling, you know there's so much pressure. And so what they do is they lift a cap very similar to this, so crown seal, and essentially that pressure shoots the frozen sediment out. And because there's space in the bottle, they top it up with a mixture of sugar and wine, and that's what gives you the sweetness. So if you've seen Brut, which is the most common that we're all sort of familiar with, that is reflecting the sweetness, how much sugar is actually added or not added through that topping up process. That is the traditional method. And this one goes through that traditional method, but you may not be able to see it in this video, but you might be able to see that it's a little bit hazy. And that's because we actually haven't disgorged it. So it's got all of those nice sort of biscuity, toasty flavors that are integrating into the wine. So this is why this is so unique and such a fantastic producer. As I said, they pioneered Prosecco here in Australia. They give us an opportunity to actually try the traditional way that it's made, which is very uncommon. We generally have that tank method. So talking you through the tank method, the tank method is essentially protecting or preserving those key varietal characteristics. So when we have a tank method, what we're essentially doing is we're not fermenting in the bottle. We're essentially putting that wine in a tank, and as it's fermenting, we still have that release of CO2. We've got a tank that is essentially sealed, so it does then give us that opportunity to still have that CO2 integrate into the wine, which gives it the bubbles. And then it's, instead of that disgorged and riddling process, it actually is, the sediment is filtered out via the tank, and then it's bottled what they call under pressure. And that is essentially what preserves or retains those bubbles. So really interesting wine, fantastic producer, such a great expression of the traditional method in a Prosecco, which you don't often get to try. Yeah, definitely can see why their other Prosecco that's made in that tank method did win Prosecco of the Year. But if you want to try the traditional method, this is definitely a producer to look into. Cheers.